The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 2.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you take a broad look at the history of philosophy from Greece through the 18th century, you'll see that there have been two basic types of philosophers. Those who declared that reason could know reality, and those who declared that it could not, that reason was impotent to know reality. In the first class, we can put all the major philosophers, or pretty much all of the major philosophers through the 18th century. Plato, Aristotle, and most of their followers in the 17th and 18th centuries. No matter how much these philosophers disagree with each other as to what reality is, what reason is, how reason acquires knowledge of reality, no matter how much they disagree about the role of the senses and whether there's innate ideas and so on, they all tended to believe that there was a reality and that man's reason, however they interpret it, could know it. In the second class, that is, in the class of those who explicitly deny reason's power to know reality, we can subdivide that into two groups. On the one hand, the crude, overt, explicit mystics. Most of these, I may say, were in the Christian era, in the medieval era. We did not look at them last week, but they're the ones who hold explicitly that reason is useless. It can't acquire knowledge of reality, and if we're to acquire such knowledge, we need to appeal to mystic trances, ineffable revelations, supernatural feelings, etc., you name it. And the other subgroup among the reason deniers is, of course, the skeptics like David Hume, who simply say that reason can't know reality, there's no non-rational means of knowing, and therefore knowledge of reality is just impossible. We can't have it. Now, I want you to observe that all of these philosophers, all of them, whatever their disagreements, hold that the question of man's ability to know reality is the most crucial, overwhelmingly important issue of philosophy. That was the central question to which their philosophies were addressed. They disagreed on their answers, but they all agreed that the issue was urgently important, that it's a matter of life and death importance. And so long as this state of affairs was the case, there was hope for philosophy. It couldn't rest content with either mysticism or skepticism. The uselessness and invalidity of mystic trances and so on as a means to knowing reality was apparent to philosophers since the Renaissance. If it was crucial for man to know reality as they held, then mysticism had to be rejected. And notice they held you could not rest content with skepticism either. The skeptics themselves were tortured by their own conclusions. They recognized, after all, that men live in reality, and therefore they can only live by means of a knowledge of reality. And lacking such knowledge, the skeptics themselves were paralyzed, helpless, unable to live, act, or function. For instance, this is clear in the case of David Hume. When he would leave his desk after a day of writing, he reported, and go out to visit his friends, he found that he had to entirely banish from his mind his own philosophy because he couldn't take a step so long as he remembered the conclusions he had come to that day during the writing of his philosophy. He bemoaned his own conclusions. He had to put them out of his mind, and when he came back after a night with friends and read what he wrote, he thought to himself, this is strained, unreal, ridiculous. I can't possibly live by it. However, of course, he couldn't answer it, so he had a big problem. The point, however, is that outbreaks of skepticism constantly occurred in philosophy through this whole period, up through the 18th century, but they never lasted up to this point because it was recognized that you couldn't live by a skeptical philosophy. The consensus of philosophers was, if reason can't know reality, then you have to be either a medieval type of mystic or a helpless, tortured, paralyzed skeptic, and both of these were unacceptable. And therefore, after each outbreak of mysticism or skepticism, a new wave of philosophers started again to try to defend the pro-reason view and show that reason really could know reality. The consequences of rejecting reason's power to know reality seem to everybody too horrible and too obvious. Now, I want you to try to imagine this evening a completely different approach to philosophy, unprecedented so far, different from all of these that I've so far mentioned. Imagine somebody who says, what difference does it make whether we know reality or not? Why bother about reality? Who cares? Reality is, so to speak, out of date. Let's just dispense altogether with the issue of reality. We don't have to be raving mystics. We can be civilized, sensible, enlightened, even scientific. And we don't have to be tortured skeptics bemoaning our fate like Hume. Our view will simply be, who needs reality? Now, a view of this sort would be a new phenomenon in philosophy. We could think of it as a complacent skepticism. A skepticism which says we don't know reality and it doesn't make any difference that we don't know it. We can live and function regardless of reality. We can do without it. We don't have to appeal to mystic trances or to try to answer the skeptics. Let's just reconceive what reason is in such a way that reality doesn't come up. And if someone at some point says to us, your ideas aren't true to reality, we'll say, so what? Who needs reality? Now, you may think this is a bizarre view, but there are a great many people today who, by implication, share this view. Have you ever heard a person say, who knows what's really true? Who can say what reality is? How do I know what's true or false, right or wrong in reality? I'm sure you've met many such types. Well, you'd think if a person held such a view that he'd be paralyzed, like Hume was. Because after all, he lives in reality. How can he function in it if he claims to know nothing about it? And yet somehow such people seem at least to go on functioning. How do they do it? Well, obviously they believe a knowledge of reality is not required for life, that a knowledge of reality is dispensable, that something else can take its place. Notice, they're not advocates of reason, the people I'm talking about, because they don't believe reason can know reality. But most of them don't appeal to mystic trances. Some of them on the fringes do, but most of the ones on the street don't. And they're not paralyzed and tortured a la Hume. They're blithely complacent skeptics. Why? Why doesn't it bother? Now, the answer to these questions is found in the philosopher that we are beginning tonight. The man who invented this kind of approach to philosophy virtually single-handedly. In other words, the approach that a knowledge of reality is dispensable, we can get along sanely and sensibly without any reference to the way things really are. And that approach is, of course, Immanuel Kant's. He is the man who made skepticism endure for centuries, who entrenched skepticism into the very heart of Western culture. In fact, just to give you a teaser at the outset, he held that skepticism about reality is not only tolerable, it's absolutely necessary if you are to live and function rationally. Kant held that only if you are a skeptic can you live by reason. I'll repeat, only if you are a skeptic can you live by reason. In other words, it's the people who insist on the importance of knowing reality that cause all the trouble. Now, how did he do it? By what means? That's our subject tonight. Now, you might think it's obviously hopeless. How could anybody put over such an idea? But you should know that Kant has, as a matter of fact, one of the most ingenious, complex, integrated, comprehensive systems in the whole history of philosophy. Notice I didn't say true, but those other adjectives are applicable. He ranks in terms of ingenuity, scope, integration, and influence almost with Plato and Aristotle. And normally philosophers think of the big three as Plato, Aristotle, and Kant. And it's been said, and quite correctly, you cannot understand philosophy since Kant unless you understand Kant. And that's why we're devoting 2 lectures to his philosophy. This evening, I want to engage only in exposition without criticism. I want to present to you Kant's basic approach, and then near the end of the lecture, if there's time, begin to indicate his arguments in favor of his view, and then next week we will put forth some further arguments for his view, look at his ethics, and engage in some criticism. I want you this evening to attempt to follow me, understand I'm going to give myself the premise of trying to make Kant as plausible as I can, because you cannot fight it until you hear the best case you can for it. A few preliminary simple facts. Kant's dates, if you wish, are 1724 to 1804, so he's roughly contemporary with Hume. And his philosophy is often called the critical philosophy with a capital C. This word is derived from the name of his major works, the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of Practical Reason, the Critique of Judgment. By critique, he means a critical investigation, the power and nature of reason. And because he so commonly used the term critique, his conclusions have come to be called the critical philosophy, with a capital C as a technical term. All right, let's plunge into Kant. And since he was primarily concerned to answer Hume, the place to start is with Hume. Now, you recall Hume's universe from last week. A shattered, disintegrated universe, a stream of qualities, little atoms of sense experience, as we can call them, going by without connection. There were no entities, merely a floating bundle of qualities that could disintegrate, split apart at any instant. You remember my cigarette from last week and the fate that I projected for it on Humean grounds. And there was no causality, no cause and effect, merely a stream of floating events succeeding one another chaotically with no tie between them, no necessary connection binding them together, no causal chains. The major problem then that Hume bequeathed to Kant is that everything is shattered, disintegrated, disconnected. Well, what we have to do, says Kant, is put the universe back together again. In other words, we have to perform a synthesis. That's his word. The problem we confront is the problem of synthesis, and synthesis simply means putting parts together into a whole. And that's the problem we have, synthesizing events into causal chains, synthesizing qualities into unified entities. Hume left us with a universe like Humpty Dumpty after the fall. Kant is going to synthesize the fragments and give us an intelligible world again. Now let's specify the problem a bit. I'm going to lead you step by step. Hopefully at some point we'll reach the stage where you see, aha, that was Kant's solution. Because you could say, on the basis of what I presented so far, well, don't we already have a synthesis of these sensory atoms? As a matter of fact, you might say the sensory atoms that we experience do go together in our actual experience. They don't, as a matter of fact, disintegrate. The events we observe do go together in patterns of regular sequence, one following the other. We never find a case when we throw a rock with a certain force and it suddenly turns into Hegel, etc. There is order in the succession of events. So in fact, you could say there is synthesis, there is togetherness in our experience. We don't literally experience the shattered, disintegrated atoms of sense experience. And if Hume heard this, they'd say, well, of course, that's all fine, but the big question is, what evidence do you have that these sensory qualities will stay together in the future? What evidence do you have that events will remain regularly connected in the future? If we could know that the syntheses we experience are necessary, that they had to be the case, then all would be well, and we could predict the future. If we could know that there was a necessary law of reality, a necessary law, to the effect that qualities have to belong to enduring entities and can't split apart and float off, or a law to the effect that events have to be connected with other events in regular sequence, then we'd be okay. But this, says Hume, is just what we don't know and have no way to establish. In other words, the syntheses we observe are based strictly on experience. They are empirical syntheses, and that, remember from last week, means they are merely contingent syntheses. They happen to be the case, but it's simply a brute fact devoid of necessity. You recall Hume's view from last week, we cannot get a knowledge of necessity from experience. And therefore, of course, since all we have is contingent syntheses, we can make no predictions about the future. Anything is possible, all is lost. So the problem of synthesis is really the problem of necessary synthesis, of putting the disconnected atoms or fragments together in ways which we know have to be a certain way and on which we can therefore rely. Now notice here that Kant agrees entirely with Hume that we cannot get necessity from experience. He agrees with that completely. That all experience gives us is brute, contingent facts, that it never tells us what has to be so, simply that as a matter of brute fact, certain things happen to be so. This idea is absolutely fundamental to Kant's philosophy. He takes it over from Hume without question or challenge. No amount of experience, he says, will ever give us a knowledge of necessity. We can't perceive or experience necessity. You remember the point from last week. Well, you might say, couldn't we arrive at a knowledge of necessity not by directly experiencing it, but by reasoning from what we do experience? So we would still arrive at a knowledge of necessity on the basis of experience, even though we don't directly experience necessity. And to that question, Kant, along with Hume, says no, you couldn't. For a simple reason. He says in any valid process of reasoning, you can't have something in your conclusion that wasn't in your premises. If I say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, you'd say to me, that's obviously invalid reasoning. How did you suddenly get a reference to Napoleon in your conclusion when there's no reference to Napoleon in your premises? Well, Kant applies the same type of argument to the question of getting necessity by reasoning from experience. He says from experience, our premises only tell us what is the case. And no amount of reasoning from premises which tell us what is the case is going to give us a conclusion as to what must be the case. We can't get a must in our conclusion if we don't already have it in our premises. So in sum, we cannot experience necessity directly, and we can't derive it by reasoning from what we do experience. All we get from experience is the brute fact, simply what is. No amount of observation or reasoning is ever going to introduce the must, the has to be, the necessity. All of this Kant takes over from Hume. Now, I've stated now the essential problem as Kant saw it, the problem of necessary synthesis. I want to give you Kant's technical terms for stating the same problem. I'm really introducing nothing new now but terminology, but Kant's terminology has become standard for philosophers since his time. We'll encounter it again, and it's enormously famous. Kant takes over with certain modifications, the distinction of Hume's that we introduced last week, the distinction between two radically opposite types of proposition. Remember the distinction between what Hume called relations of ideas and matters of facts. I want briefly to review the main points of that distinction because Kant takes it over and then does some spectacular things with it. Take as, if you want, a couple of examples of relations of ideas. Take the statement, triangles have three sides, or brothers are male. Those would qualify as relations of ideas in Hume's terminology. And on the other side, for examples of matters of fact, take, for instance, triangles were studied in ancient Greece, or brothers are jealous of one another. Now, for tonight, let's not argue about whether brothers are or aren't jealous. Let's just assume it's true for purposes of example. Now, what are the basic differences between these two types of statements according to Hume? Well, the first type, so-called relation of ideas, according to Hume, can be established or validated by logic alone. Their opposite would be a contradiction. If I say a triangle does not have three sides, since the definition of triangle is a plane figure bounded by three straight sides, I would be saying, if I denied that statement, a figure with three straight sides does not have three sides, and that would be a contradiction. And therefore we can establish such a statement, says Hume, strictly by logic. We simply specify the definition of the subject term, triangle, brother, whatever it has to be, and the truth of the statement follows as a matter of logic. That's the so-called logical truth, and since its opposite is a contradiction, its opposite is literally inconceivable. You just couldn't imagine a nine-sided triangle or a female brother, etc. On the other hand, the second type cannot be established by logic. There is, according to Hume, now remember, I'm presenting a viewpoint which is profoundly opposed to the objectivist viewpoint, so I won't keep saying according to Hume, but according to Hume, the second type involves no contradiction if you deny it. The opposite is perfectly conceivable or imaginable, and therefore you can't establish it by logic. If a space traveler went off to another planet and came back and said, you know, there's a strange thing about triangles there, they've never studied them. Or, the strange thing about brothers, they all love one another and they're never jealous. You'd say, well, that's different from the way it is down here, but I can imagine that. There's no contradiction. But if he came back and he said, you know, the funny thing about all triangles there is that they have 18 sides, you'd say, impossible, that can't be. So on the one side, we have logical truths whose opposite is a contradiction, and on the other, truths that can't be established by logic, whose opposite is perfectly conceivable or imaginable. Another point of distinction, which I just mentioned because we made it clear, I think, last week, the first type are necessary, they must be the case. The second are simply contingent, they happen to be so, they don't have to be. A third point of distinction. The first type are a priori, remember, independent of experience. No experience, according to Hume, is necessary to validate. You simply have to consult your definition of triangle or brother and spin out its consequences. I'd like you to note that a priori here, as we use it here, means simply independent of experience. It is not a synonym for innate. If we take the statement, brothers are male, that would be regarded as a priori. That doesn't mean we're born with it or we don't need experience. Hume and Kant would say you need experience to acquire the individual concepts that make up that proposition. You need experience of brother or experience of males in order to form such concepts. But the point of calling it a priori is that the combination of those concepts, once you form them on the basis of experience, their combination into a true statement is something we don't need any experience for. Once we form the concepts, we put them together and establish the truth of their connection in a proposition strictly by reference to logic without reference to experience. And Hume would say no experience could possibly validate these relations of ideas. We take again, brothers are male. Suppose you said, well, I learned that on the basis of experience. Hume would say, how would you go about learning that by experience? Suppose you said, well, I'll just go out and study brothers and observe whether they're male or not. Well, you can see from some of your smiles that that would seem to be a hopeless procedure, because you wouldn't count anything as a brother unless you knew already that it was male. If somebody pointed out to you a woman and said, well, that refutes your claim that all brothers are male, here's a female brother, you would immediately come back and say, look, if it's female, it can't be a brother, because to be a brother is to be male simply by definition. In other words, says Hume, I couldn't even attempt to validate that sort of proposition by experience, by going out and investigating brothers, because I'll have to already know its truth before I can even try to validate it. So experience is irrelevant in validating such statements. Whereas in the other type, the matters of fact, of course, they are dependent on experience, they are a posteriori. And the final distinction of Hume, final point of this distinction, the first type are not factual, they are conventional, and merely the result of our definitions. They say nothing about the actual world, whereas the second type is factual, they do tell us something about the actual world. Now, Kant takes over this Humean distinction, but introduces two new terms, analytic and synthetic. I'd like you to be familiar with those two terms. They're defined in terms of the concepts of subject and predicate. By subject, we simply mean in this connection whatever you're talking about, and by predicate, whatever you say about it. So if I say brothers are male, brothers is the subject, male is the predicate. If I say triangles are studied in ancient Greece, triangle is the subject, that they're studied in ancient Greece is the predicate. Now what does Kant mean by analytic and synthetic? An analytic statement is a proposition whose truth can be established simply by an analysis of the meaning or definition of the subject term. I'll repeat that. An analytic statement is one whose truth can be established strictly by an analysis of the meaning or definition of the subject term. Like brothers are male. Simply by analyzing the meaning of the term brother, which is male sibling, we can get the predicate male out of it. And it's called analytic, you see, because you can establish the truth strictly by analysis. In this case, says Kant, the predicate adds nothing new to what was already in the subject. It merely makes explicit what was implicitly contained in the definition of the subject. Analytic propositions, he says, are therefore establishable strictly by logic. The opposite would be a contradiction. They have all the characteristics of Hume's relation of ideas, including, of course, that they're not factual. They simply express our own conceptual manipulations. The other type Kant calls synthetic truths. Now, synthetic can be simply defined as any truth which is not analytic. But if you want a more positive definition, it would be any truth in which the predicate adds something onto the subject that wasn't already contained in it. In other words, the predicate adds something that was not logically contained in the definition of the subject, like brothers are jealous. You couldn't get jealous as a fact out of brother. No matter how much you study the definition of brother, male sibling, you never get jealousy out of that. That's a new fact added on in the statement, brothers are jealous, that you couldn't derive by logical analysis of the definition of the subject. And thus it's called a synthetic judgment, you see, because the predicate adds on or synthesizes something to the subject which is not already contained in the subject. And this corresponds to what Hume called matters of fact. Synthetic statements for Kant tell us something about actual fact, not just our conceptual manipulations, but they can't be established by logic, of course. So for Kant, every true proposition can be classified as analytic or synthetic. Either the predicate can be derived by logical means from the subject, or, in which case it's analytic, or the subject can't be derived by logical means. The predicate can't be derived by logical means. It's something new added on, in which case it's synthetic. Now, prior to Kant, it had been held that in theory there's only two possible ways of establishing the truth of a proposition. In other words, of establishing the connection between the subject and the predicate, how you know that that connection is true. And the two possible ways that philosophers had thought prior to Kant were either you establish that the proposition is true by consulting logic, or you establish that it's true by consulting experience. And that would give us only two possible types of truth. If you established it by logic, as in the brothers are male type of case, then it's analytic, a priori necessary. However, if you establish it by experience, in other words, you can't get it by logical analysis, then it's synthetic, a posteriori contingent. So, on the traditional pre-Kantian view, logic gives you analytic truths, just your own conceptual manipulations. Experience gives you brute, contingent, synthetic truths. And it seems, since logic and experience are all we have to go by, that there's no possibility for a third type of truth. But here is Kant's first crucial point. Neither of these two types of truth fills our philosophic need or solves Hume's problem. Analytic truths obviously won't help us, says Kant, because they're non-factual, remember, non-informative. They don't tell us anything about the actual world. They merely make explicit what's contained in our arbitrary definitions. Like centaurs are half horses is an analytic truth. I arbitrarily define centaur to include half man, half horse. So when I say centaurs are half horses, I can establish that by logic, but it's just a conceptual manipulation. In other words, we get a cheap or easy victory when we employ analytic truths. We get necessity and security, but precisely because these truths say nothing about the world. In our problems with entities, causality, and so on, this type of truth can't be the solution. We want to know about the qualities and events that we actually experience in the world. We don't want just linguistic manipulations. We want the kind of truth that gives us real information about facts. In other words, the crucial truths that we need to validate are synthetic, not analytic, which means that the crucial truths we need to validate cannot be established by logic. So logic is out as a hope to solving our problem. But of course, synthetic truths, as Hume conceived them, synthetic a posteriori contingent truths are no good to us either, because since they're contingent, they're not necessary, not reliable, we can't know tomorrow. So we can say that the crucial truths that we need can't be established on the basis of experience either. What we need, said Kant, is a kind of proposition nobody had realized before him. We need a proposition that has to have a combination of characteristics that everyone had said you couldn't have. It has to be, in his terminology, at once synthetic and a priori. Synthetic as opposed to analytic. Synthetic so that it'll be factual, informative, tell us something about the actual world we live in, and yet it has to be a priori, independent of experience, because if it depends on experience, it's simply contingent, and we need necessary truths. And if we need necessity, that means it must be a priori. We need, in a short, a type of truth which gives us facts, in other words, is synthetic, and yet is necessary. And that means we have to be able to learn it independently of experience. And the question Kant asks now is, how can there be such a thing as a synthetic a priori proposition? On the face of it, it seems impossible. If it's synthetic, it can't be established by logic, because remember, logic establishes only analytic truth. If it's a priori, it can't be established by experience, because experience gives us merely contingent truth. Seems that it's a hopeless quest. Apart from experience, all we can know is our conceptual manipulation, so it seems. Necessary, but empty. From experience, we can know facts, but they're brute contingent facts. We need to know necessary facts about the world, yet we need to know them apart from experience. And, says Kant, this is the central problem of the critique of pure reason. How to achieve a knowledge of necessary facts apart from experience. That's what he actually means by saying that his crucial question is, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? That's the crucial question he claims to answer. Well, can we get any help in answering this question by looking at earlier schools of philosophy, the rationalists and the empiricists being the two big schools? Well, in a word, no, we can't. But let's look briefly at why, so you'll be a little clearer what Kant's problem is. The rationalist solution to this problem was to claim innate ideas. They claimed that a knowledge of necessary laws of reality was born into them. In other words, that they had a priori knowledge of necessary facts of reality. Just simply born into them. Kant rejects this solution, and please note that. He holds that it's impossible, and for a very good reason. Reality, says Kant, is independent of man, independent of the content of human beliefs. It is what it is regardless of what people's beliefs are. Even suppose that we were born with innate ideas, he asks. How could we ever know that reality would conform to these innate ideas? Why should reality conform to our innate ideas even if we had them? Just because we hold a belief doesn't mean reality is going to snap into line and obey it. If reality is independent of us, and Kant holds it is, then the only way to know what it's like is to observe it. Even if we had innate ideas, then we'd have no way of knowing that these innate ideas are true of reality. So we have to give up the rationalist view of innate knowledge of reality's necessary laws. That, says Kant, is hopeless, and he rejects it. Can the empiricists help us? Well, again, obviously No, because while they base all of their conclusions on experience, we get from them only factual contingent information. We need this fantastic combination, he says, of synthetic necessary truths. How will we do it? Well, now, if you understand the problem, let's try and see if we can develop some leads to a solution. We said the problem is synthesis. Well, let's follow this lead. Put the same thing another way. The problem is getting the atoms of experience into certain relationships with one another. And notice this is a special kind of problem. It's not that we're missing some atoms of experience. That would be a completely different sort of problem. Suppose, for instance, that life depended absolutely upon our having an experience of blue. And our entire lives, future sanity and science depended on our experiencing blue, and we couldn't find it. Then we'd be missing a little atom of experience, you see, namely blue, and that would be one type of problem. But that isn't our problem at all. We're not short of the atoms of experience, but that we can't put these atoms together into unified related groups or causal chains. We've got all the elements that we need for knowledge, but we don't have the relations. Putting it another way, we've got the stuff of knowledge, but not the organization. Or using Aristotle's terms as Kant does, we've got the matter of knowledge, but not the form. These are technical terms. Matter simply means the stuff, the filling, the content. Form means the organization, the relationship, the way the content is put together. What we need is not more matter, but the form, the organization. Now let's make up a physical analogy. This is just an analogy. Please don't take it literally, but it'll help to make the problem clear, and I think help to make Kant's solution clear. This is my own analogy. I made this up. It's not Kant's. Let us take Hume's little sensory atoms literally for a moment. Visualize them, if you want, as little physical pellets. And let's suppose that in the process of experience, these little pellets from the outside world bombard our bodies, travel up various routes through the nerves in the body, etc., through the brain, and there are we at the end of the process, the end of the chain, a little back behind our brains, watching the end product as it reaches us. And suppose, as is the case, that we see these pellets actually always appearing in certain regular combinations, in certain regular order. The empiricists are standing there, see, and they say, well, fine, it's orderly up to now, how do you know tomorrow? Just because you see it now doesn't prove anything. The rationalists say, we don't even have to look. We know, independent of any experience, by means of our innate ideas, that reality must be made up of enduring combinations, and therefore we can be guaranteed that these pellets are going to go together in certain ways. To which Kant says, how can you possibly know that? Because you didn't get it from studying reality. Well, do we have any clues to a solution? Because believe it or not, after this long build-up, we're on the threshold of a solution. What have we established so far? We need to get these pellets together. We need necessary synthesis, and that can't come from experience. So somehow, it must be a function of our minds in some way. To this extent, Kant says the rationalists are entirely right. Somehow, this necessary synthesis must be a contribution of our minds independently of experience. But we know that it can't be that our minds give us innate information about reality's necessary laws. It can't be that our minds give us innate truths, that reality is this way or that way. We've seen why Kant rejects that. Our minds don't give us innate content, but they give us something. And now all we have to do is add in the third piece of information that we know. We don't need content. We don't need information. We need only the relationships. We need only the organization. We need only the putting together of the elements we're given. We don't, in a word, need information. We need a synthesizing activity. A synthesizing activity. Well, now, let's be bold, as Kant was. I don't say true, but bold. Let's put forth the following hypothesis. Let's say the mind does make necessary synthesis possible, not by knowing innately in advance of experience that reality will be made of synthesized combinations, but by performing the synthesis itself. In other words, the mind will be the source of the syntheses, not in the sense that it recognizes or identifies a synthesis which exists independently of it in reality, but in the sense that the mind actually brings that synthesis into existence itself by its own activities. On this view, we'll say it's not that the mind knows or discovers laws out there independent of it. It doesn't discover them either by experience or innately. It creates those laws. It doesn't discover them, it creates them. Now, in terms of the analogy that I just gave you, the analogy of the pellets coming up the pipeline, and there you are at the end. Suppose that as these pellets are coming up, now this is just an analogy, remember, and it's going to get pretty crude in a moment, but it'll give you the idea. Suppose that as these pellets come up the pipeline, the various nerves to the brain, a little before they reach the end, that is, before they reach us and we're back there at the end watching the end product, there is a little man with a collection of sticky pins. And as the pellets come by, the various ones representing sensory qualities, he spears them with this pin in various combinations. He sticks a pin in them, binds them together, and then sends them on their way down the pipeline. And there are we at the end. And when it reaches us, we say, aha, an entity, cluster of qualities necessarily connected. And of course, he's got all kinds of different pins, as we'll see. Another one is what we might call a causality pin. And as events come up the pipeline, he spears the appropriate ones with his pin and sends them on down. And when we get them, they always follow one another in a certain order because he's caught them as they come up and stuck them together in a causal way. Now, there's no use you saying, of course, well, I've never experienced any such little man, because obviously, by the nature of this hypothesis, the little man operates on a level prior to experience. It doesn't get to you before it's been processed by him. First, he sticks all the pins in, and then it reaches you. So, of course, by the nature of it, you couldn't experience the pinning. You can only see the end product after he's done it. Now, suppose we knew that this little man was not lazy, to continue out the metaphor, that he had a compulsion, an irresistible compulsion. He had to catch all the pellets as they came up the pipeline. That was his, in effect, metaphysical job in life, and he never shirked it. And we knew that without question. Then we could say, we know for sure that we will always perceive an orderly world. We will always perceive entities, never a cluster of dissociated qualities, because it won't get to us before it passes the little man, and therefore it has to be regular entities when it reaches us. And we know for sure the world will never go wild, with pennies turning into Hegel and Hegel turning into quarters, etc., because the little man will spear them in the kind of combination so that when it gets to us, it'll always be perfectly orderly. We'll know, in other words, that the syntheses into entities, into causal chains, and so on, will be absolutely necessary as far as we are concerned, as far as we're concerned. As far as our experience is concerned, those syntheses will be necessary because we can't experience it until it goes through the little man. Now, this is, in essence, Kant's theory. our minds, our pre-conscious minds, on a level beneath sense experience, are like complex machines, complex processing, synthesizing mechanisms, which process the data that they get from reality in a great many different ways before those data reach consciousness. And of course, my man with the little pins is just a crude metaphor for what he actually holds are certain synthesizing activities, certain putting together mechanisms built into the nature and constitution of the human mind and which operate beneath the level of sense experience. What we do is bind together, organize, relate, we meaning the basic nature of our mind, the data in a great many ways, and after our minds have done that, they send it up to us, and we then experience consciously an orderly, lawful world. The mind, in short, according to Kant, does not discover law and order in the world. It doesn't discover law and order either by experience or by having innate advanced information prior to experience. It doesn't discover at all. It creates law and order by its own subjective, pre-conscious synthesizing activities. Now let's take a break at this point so you can digest this much, and then we'll see where Kant goes after the break. All right, let us continue with Kant. We concluded with his general thesis, his solution to the problems of preceding philosophy. Our pre-conscious minds, I'm just summarizing for you the point that we made right at the end. Our pre-conscious minds are like complex processing, synthesizing mechanisms. They process the data that we get from reality in a great many ways before those data reach consciousness. The mind doesn't then discover a law and order in the world. It is the actual source of them. It creates them. You can see then that Kant agrees with the rationalists on a certain crucial point. He agrees that experience is not a sufficient foundation of human knowledge, that something in the mind is required, some crucial contribution on the part of the mind, a contribution not derived from reality but brought in by the mind's own nature. He agrees with the rationalists that if we were born tabula rasa, you recall that phrase from last week, empty completely, just a blank slate, then things would be hopeless and we would not be able to acquire knowledge. But he disagrees with the rationalists in the question of what is it that the mind contributes or supplies. For Kant, what the mind contributes or supplies independent of experience is synthesizing activities, certain ways of putting the data together, as against what the rationalists had held, namely innate information or innate content. As it's sometimes put, the rationalists prior to Kant believed that we had innate content, information about reality prior to experience. Kant believes the mind has not innate content, but an innate structure. That's the way it's sometimes put. You can think of it like this. Suppose we took a little rationalist baby, that is to say a baby built on the model of the rationalist school, and we could somehow fluoroscope his mind and find out what was in it prior to all experience. Well, if we peered into this particular baby's mind, we'd find that he's got all sorts of information about reality. And this little baby would know, although he couldn't tell us at this stage, but he would know every event in reality has a cause. Reality is made up out of entities which are enduring sets of qualities and so on, and you'd be really amazed at the amount of information we could extract from this little rationalist baby. On the other hand, if we looked at a little Kantian scale baby, what his mind has prior to any experience, he doesn't actually know anything. He has no content. It's empty, but it isn't just a flat slate on which the facts of reality will write. It has a definite structure. There's a whole machine in there, a whole set of organizing, processing devices all ready to start operating. So we've got the relating machinery ready to start chugging as soon as we feed it any experiential content. That's the main difference between the rationalists and Kant. When does the Kantian baby actually begin to acquire knowledge? Only when the little pellets actually enter. In other words, only with experience. To that extent, Kant says the empiricists are right. All knowledge begins with experience. Apart from experience, we have the relating machinery, but we don't have the stuff that it relates. Now, we've gone on close to an hour, so you'll be happy to know we've now reached the first sentence of the Critique of Pure Reason, which is to the effect that it's true that all knowledge begins with experience, but it doesn't follow that that means all knowledge comes out of experience. And I think you now see in what sense he means that. All knowledge begins with experience. Only when the data starts coming are we able to know anything. But it doesn't all arise out of experience, because the crucial other factor is the relating, synthesizing machinery which puts it together. Now, to anticipate, but you need to know this now, there are for Kant 14 different types of synthesizing activity that the mind engages in. I'll tell you what some of the key ones are. In many cases this evening, you will not have the faintest idea how could these things represent synthesizing activities. And unfortunately, even after we discuss it next week, it will not be very clear in some cases, because Kant is not very clear. But you just take it from me for now that Kant holds that all of these 14 are simply synthesizing activities performed by the mind. How they are synthesizing activities we'll try to look at later. A couple of them we've mentioned. We have a causality synthesizing activity that puts events into causal chains. We have an entity synthesizing activity that binds qualities into entities. We have a spatial synthesizer. In other words, spatiality, is one of the little filtering processing devices that the mind has, and when the data come through, there's a mechanism which spreads them out in space and thus gives us a spatial world. Time is another one that's in there, as we'll see. And when the data come through in themselves, they're not in time, but the inner mechanism of the mind spreads them out in a time series, so some come earlier and some come later. Even existence is one of those processing devices, so that when the material comes through from reality, the mind confers existence upon it. Quantity is one of those processing devices. When you look around you and see a world of one thing, many things, all things, when you use such quantitative terms, that's only made possible, according to Kant, because one of the processing devices, or several of them, confer quantitative characteristics on things. So, as you see, there's a whole set of these. We'll look at what they are in order when we finish our basic presentation. And what it comes to then is that all of the fundamental features and laws of the world that we experience are actually contributions of the structure of our mind. Space, time, existence, causality, entity, quantity, and others. All of that is a mental contribution. Now, from that, we can draw a perfectly obvious conclusion, which nevertheless might startle you. Can we ever know anything about reality? Reality now, as it is in itself, what Kant calls things in themselves, to which his answer is no. You never can know things in themselves. What can you know? Only things after they have gone through this processing, synthesizing device. You can only know the world as it appears to the human mind after the human mind has processed it. And in that process it adds all these features, which presumably are not applicable to things in themselves. There are therefore, according to Kant, two radically different worlds or dimensions. On the one hand, the world as it appears to us, and borrowing from a Greek term, he calls that the phenomenal world. Using phenomenal not in the sense of a Hollywood movie, but in the sense of the world of appearance, the world as it seems to human beings. And that is the world of actual experience, the phenomenal world, the world we have processed. The world as it is in itself, true reality, things in themselves, that he calls the noumenal world, again derivative of a Greek term, that's N-O-U-M-E-N-A-L, the noumenal world, and about that world he says we can know nothing whatever. And you see therefore that my analogy about the pellets is a very poor analogy, because the pellets was supposed to be the information given you directly from reality before processing. But pellets, after all, are physical. They're spread out in space, and they come in temporal succession one after the other. And there's a number of them, so they have quantitative characteristics, and they exist. So my statement that imagine pellets is obviously invalid, because the little pellets in themselves, well, we can't think of them as spatial or temporal or existing or having any quantity. Well, you might say, how can we think of them then? How can we think of reality in itself, the data in itself, before processing? And to which, of course, Kant's answer is you cannot think of it. It's entirely inconceivable. It's completely cut off from us. We have no contact with it at all. We know it only after it's processed, and then it becomes a radically different dimension. Now you might say, well, why didn't Kant just simply throw out reality altogether if he never came into any contact with it? And of course, if he had done that, he would be Hegel. But he was not that advanced. Kant said there must actually be a reality in itself, because where, after all, do we get the data, the atoms, the stuff that our mind is then synthesizing or processing? There must be some source of the ultimate information which our mind then puts together and confers these characteristics on. Reality, therefore, he held on to as the provider of the matter, and the mind impressed the form on it. But the matter in itself, the thing in itself, reality in itself, is completely unknowable. Now you might ask, well then, if it's completely unknowable, might it be like the phenomenal world? Might it be a world of entities, obeying cause and effect? And the normal Kantian answer is there's no use speculating. It might be, it might not be. We can't possibly know, and therefore we can't have any views. It's just completely cut off from us. But, and here we reach a very important conclusion, the Kantians say it doesn't make any difference. It's completely unimportant that we can't know reality, because for all practical and theoretical purposes, the question doesn't come up. As long as we could learn the mental processing devices that this little man, to use my analogy, uses, so long as we could establish for sure the laws that he is going to impose, and you understand that's just an analogy, but if we could understand the laws that he is going to impose on the phenomenal world, on the world we experience, what do we care what happens in reality? Let reality be any kind of nightmare you want. We don't live in it. We don't perceive it. We live in our own world that we ourselves create. And we can have perfect security, sanity, civilization, science, rationality in that world of our own creation, regardless of what happens in reality. And thus, my initial point that we can dispense with reality and still live a perfectly sane, sensible life. All it depends upon is that we could specify and prove what the functions of the little man are, what types of synthesizing activities the mind has to engage in. And of course, that was the goal of the critique of pure reason, to specify and prove what these synthesizing activities are. So we do not have to be paralyzed skeptics. Even though we don't know reality, we can get along perfectly well without it. Now, Kant says, I've given you a solution to the problem of synthetic necessary knowledge. I've given you the only possible explanation of synthetic necessary knowledge. If you want to know what binds together, what connects the subject and the predicate, what makes it necessary, it's not logic, it's not experience. The third factor I've introduced is the structure of the mind, the synthesizing activities of the mind. Let's take a simple example. Suppose, and here again, it's unavoidable to use analogies with Kant because it's very tricky material, and therefore you try to make it simpler by analogy, but this will be just an analogy. Suppose we observed, as a matter of fact, that everything is blue. And suppose that was crucial to life, that everything be blue. The empiricists come along and they look out and they see everything is blue and they say, well, that's fine up to now, but how do you know tomorrow? The rationalists say, we knew without even looking that it was going to be blue. We had an innate information to that respect. Kant's type of solution is simply this. Who knows what color reality is in itself? What I will prove to you is that man is born with blue spectacles taped on his eyes. Therefore, we can know for certain, as a matter of fact, that everything is going to be blue. Fact, in which world? In the phenomenal world. And we can know that it has to be blue, that that's necessary. And how do we know that? We won't see it till it goes through the blue filter. And therefore, to us, it will always have to be blue. And thus, the synthetic a priori proposition, all things are necessarily blue, would follow. If we could prove we have these blue spectacles, it would follow and we would have validated synthetic a priori, synthetic necessary information. Now all you have to do is think as an analogy, in effect, that we don't have blue spectacles, but we've got causality spectacles, and entity spectacles, and quantity spectacles, and space, and time, etc. And it goes through all this and we only get the end product. So when we say every event has a cause, for Kant, that doesn't mean events in reality. It simply means, if you wanted to translate a statement like that into Kantian method of coming at it, you'd come out with something like this. By the way the human mind is built, it must necessarily creatively synthesize the material provided by the noumenal world in such a way that in the phenomenal world we will always encounter a regular sequence of events. That's, if you wish, a translation of every event has a cause into Kantian terminology. We can notice, therefore, that all that we know is phenomena, as it's put, and anything necessary we make necessary. And that indeed is why we can know in advance of experience that these things will be necessary, that there'll be causality, that there'll be entities, etc. All the necessary laws of our experience are necessary because we make them so. Now I want to make clear what we mean by we here. Kant does not construe this as a volitional activity, and certainly not as a conscious activity. It takes place beneath the level of consciousness, prior to consciousness, and you have no choice about it. It's automatic, inexorable. It's the basic nature of the mind itself, which is true, he thinks, for all human beings. So we can put it this way. We find in experience only the laws we put there. If we didn't put the laws there, we could never find them. We'd be back in Hume's boat. If you claim no, you disagree with Kant, the laws that you know are objective, they are independent of man, then Kant would say, if it's independent of man, you can only know it by experience. But by experience, we can't get necessity, and we go down that road again, you see. And therefore, the only solution to the problem is to say that it is the human mind that actually creates the laws. Only if we are built in such a way that we have to experience in certain ways by our subjective constitution as human beings, only then can we know a priori what laws will hold. The price of knowing necessity is ignorance of reality. As it's also put, the reason the world lives up to our expectations is because we create the kind of world that has to live up to our expectations. Now, Kant claims very correctly that in putting forth this type of philosophy, he has entirely reversed the direction of philosophy, which he did. Reversed the direction completely. Prior to Kant, philosophers were all realists in this sense. They believed there was a reality out there, there was our mind in here, and the function of our mind was to conform to reality, to acquire knowledge of reality, to adapt itself to reality. That was true of the Platonists and of the Aristotelians prior to Kant. Kant says, this approach is hopeless, and therefore, what I substitute is this. It's not that our mind must conform to things, but rather things must conform to our minds. It's not the world sets the terms, and the human mind obeys, but the human mind sets the terms and the world obeys. The world here, of course, we mean the phenomenal world. There is still this vestigial, unknowable noumenal world in the background, but it's unknowable. In other words, our thought literally constructs the world we experience, the phenomenal world. Now, this reversal is what Kant refers to as his Copernican revolution. His Copernican revolution in philosophy. You know, the revolution that Copernicus was supposed to have introduced in astronomy. Prior to Copernicus, in the medieval period, it was held that we on Earth are still motionless, and that the motion is out there in the stars and the sun which revolve around us. Copernicus reversed it completely. He said, no, it isn't true. The stars at least are still, and we here on Earth are moving around them, but we mistakenly project our motion outwards. Really, the motion is in us. Well, Kant does the same thing in epistemology, or a parallel thing, he says. Prior to Kant, rationalists and empiricists held that knowledge is the recognition of existence. They argued over what is the nature of existence, what is the method of coming to know it, but they all agreed knowledge is a process of getting to know what's out there. We have to obey reality's terms. Kant says no, precisely because reality sets no terms. Just a flow of human experiences, either we impose the terms or all is lost. So that knowledge is not an activity of discovering laws, but of creating. Now you can see from this that Kant entrenched subjectivism deeply into the very fabric of all subsequent philosophy. The human mind controls, creates, dictates, shapes the world, the phenomenal world. Now, you may ask at this point, does Kant then say that any person can make up whatever world he wants, and that whatever any person wants to be true will be true for him, if that's the kind of world he wants to create? Does he say that your personal subjective wishes and hallucinations are true for you and somebody else's for him, and etc.? The answer to that is no. Believe it or not, Kant claimed to be a champion of objectivity. And he said that on his view he can make a perfectly clear distinction between the subjective and the objective. Well, how could he do it? Well, take, for instance, a pink rat. A hallucinatory pink rat that you in particular experienced because you took a certain quantity of alcohol. Now Kant would say that is clearly subjective. It just represents your personal, private experience. We can't say it has any objectivity. But, he says, the mental processing devices I'm talking about, space, time, causality, entity, etc., the ones which create the phenomenal world are not like the hallucinatory pink rat. They're outside of any individual's will or choice. They're automatic, inexorable, universal to the species, and therefore no individual can alter them. You have no choice whatever about using these processing mechanisms. And Kant says this is what we have to call objective. Objective is anything derived from the universal, inexorable nature of human consciousness. Which means, as you see, that objective, as he uses it, means a collective, universal, inexorable subjectivism. The objective is just the universal subjective. If all men necessarily impose certain subjective features on the world, that Kant calls objective. And this is a very, very influential approach today. You'll see it in pragmatism, for instance. If you ever accuse a pragmatist of subjectivism, just because he says that the true is what works, he will immediately answer, I didn't say what works for this individual or that individual. I mean what works for society, for everybody. And he will take it as though it's obvious that that means he's not an advocate of subjectivism, because he's talking about what works for mankind collectively. That is a Kantian heritage. We'll explore this equation of the objective with the collective subjective later. Ayn Rand in Atlas refers to it as the switch from the objective to the collective, and it's inherent in Kant's approach. Now, of course, collective subjectivism is still subjectivism. And in this sense, Kant is an arch subjectivist. Now, I want to give you the same point in another terminology which I'd like you to know for the remainder of the course. Namely, Kant is what we call an advocate of the primacy of consciousness. The primacy of consciousness. I'd like to explain that phrase. Let's contrast it with the opposite approach, namely the primacy of existence. Now, the primacy of existence is the Aristotelian and objectivist viewpoint in philosophy. That's the view which simply says reality exists, existence exists, it is what it is independently of consciousness, it sets the terms, and consciousness is metaphysically passive. Not epistemologically passive, it has to engage in various processes to acquire knowledge, but metaphysically passive, meaning consciousness is not a faculty for creating reality, but simply a faculty for perceiving reality, for recognizing, for identifying, for grasping what is out there independently of it. That's the philosophy of the primacy of existence. Existence comes first, it sets the terms. Consciousness is a faculty simply for looking out and grasping what's there. Now, the primacy of consciousness is the exact reversal of that view. It's the view that consciousness is the metaphysical irreducible, the metaphysical primary, and that existence or reality is simply a byproduct, a consequence, a resultant, an offshoot, whatever term you want, of consciousness. The primacy of consciousness view holds that consciousness controls, creates, dictates, in some way shapes the world, shapes existence, that existence is a product of and dependent on consciousness. Now, this is the most fundamental issue within metaphysics. Which of these has primacy? And of course, the primacy of consciousness is the most fundamental metaphysical inversion that you can perpetrate in philosophy, and the most disastrous, because it leads to the reign of complete subjectivism, the dissolving of existence, the collapse of existence in simply the whims of the controlling consciousness, whichever one it is that's given power over existence. Now, if we can use these terms, primacy of consciousness versus primacy of existence, you can better appreciate Kant's crucial role in the history of philosophy and why he was so influential. Let's go back for a moment to Christianity, the medieval Christians. They held the earliest influential version of the primacy of consciousness, what we can call the supernaturalistic version of the primacy of consciousness. That is to say, there is a giant cosmic consciousness which controls the world, a supernatural one, and of course you can guess who that is: God. God is the consciousness that created the world emanated from his conscious activity. And of course you see that there are all sorts of people today who accept that sort of metaphysics entirely uncritically, as though the primacy of consciousness is simply obvious, that of course consciousness must come first. You can see that mentality, for instance, in people who say, who created the world? Who created existence? And if you say to such a person, well, it just exists, that's where we start, they say, oh, that is unsatisfactory, inconceivable, impossible. There must be a consciousness which created it. And suppose, just for the heck of it, you were to pursue that and say, well, where did it come from? Well, if you can't just start somewhere and say something existed and you have to keep finding some more basic fact, wouldn't you need another consciousness to create the original consciousness which created the world, and then another one, and so on to an infinite series? Many people can abstractly appreciate the logic of that argument, but it doesn't upset them, because they think to themselves, well, if you have to start somewhere, it's better to start with consciousness. To make consciousness a primary is graspable, and then existence simply a derivative of it. But to make existence a primary, that seems inconceivable to me. That mentality, after, of course, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of Christianity, is deeply entrenched in a great many people. It comes up periodically, for instance, in publications like the Reader's Digest, under some such title as 12 Reasons Why a Scientist Believes in God, and the 12 reasons come down to the world is so orderly, how could there be order if it wasn't the creation of some supernatural consciousness? And of course many people believe in miracles, and a miracle is simply an example of the primacy of consciousness. The controlling supernatural consciousness periodically subjects existence to the whim of the moment and alters its functioning, and that's called a miracle. Now you see then in a general way the supernaturalistic version of the primacy of consciousness. Well, if you look at Kant in relation to this supernaturalistic view, you can see that what Kant did simply substitute a new type of the primacy of consciousness. What he did is say, let us substitute the collective human consciousness for God's. The essence of Kant's big change in the primacy of consciousness is to say, let human consciousness replace God's as the world-creating force. It's human consciousness which creates law, order, and design. It's human consciousness which shapes the world. Always remember, of course, the phenomenal world. Human consciousness is the secular stand-in now for the Christian God. Now, I hasten to say that Kant still believed in God, but in terms of his metaphysical functions, human consciousness, collective human consciousness, is usurping the functions that Christianity once gave to God. In this respect, we can say what Kant did is take over the essential metaphysics of religion and then secularize it. The Christian view is God says, let there be causality, and there is. And the Kantian view is man's mind, the deep down preconscious mind says, let there be causality, and there is. But of course man doesn't quite make it to the noumenal world the way God did. Man just makes it to the phenomenal world, the world that he himself experiences. So we can then conclude Kant's basic approach with a few simple words. Our conclusion will be, only if we are subjective in the deepest metaphysical sense, only if we grant that it's our minds which determine the laws of the world we experience, Only then can we save mankind from Hume's skepticism. Only subjectivism can give us a means of knowing unalterable laws that will be true for all men, that all of us can recognize and live by. It's recognizing the subjectivism of our knowledge which frees us from all the impossible disagreements, arbitrary disputes of the people who claim their knowledge is objective. We should be men of reason, says Kant. We should follow science, but we can be men of reason and science only if we recognize that reason and science is limited to the surface world, the world of experience, the world we ourselves create. Reason is fine and valid in its place, but the very conditions of its validity debar it from access to reality. And thus, the opening point I made this evening, only if you're a skeptic can you live by reason. If you think you know reality, then you're back in Hume's boat. Now, so much for the essentials of Kant's basic approach to philosophy. I hope you now understand the essence of the Kantian viewpoint, the Kantian revolution. But now, so far, I've offered you no proof of this whole elaborate hypothesis. I haven't given you any proof that the mind has an a priori structure that engages in all sorts of mental processing devices. The whole presentation so far has been hypothetical. It's been, if the mind has certain processing devices and so on, then we can answer Hume and save ourselves from his skepticism. But if Hume were to hear all this, of course it came out after he died, so he never got a chance to answer, but if he were to hear it, he'd simply say, what an interesting fantasy. But that's all. You haven't answered me. What about some proof that the mind has an a priori structure? What exactly are these a priori synthesizing activities that the mind performs and that you talk so much about? How do you know they exist? Can you prove they actually exist? If not, we just dismiss it all. Well, Kant has an elaborate, complex, formal proof which is designed to establish definitively, once and for all, that all of the things I've been saying so far tonight is not just a wild speculation, but is really true. And we're going to break his proof up into sections and give you at least the opening section of it this evening. Now let's get clear what we want to prove. You understand, it's not true that everything about the phenomenal world is contributed by the mind's structure. The actual data comes from the noumenal world. Our world is a product of two factors: the data out there and the mental processing devices in our mind. What we want to discover is what are the a priori synthesizing activities performed by the mind. And we want to prove that these and only these are a priori synthesizing activities. And we want to do it all systematically, so that once and for all we will know what is it we can rely on in, of course, the phenomenal world. Well, we have a question. How will we find these a priori activities? Now, you might say, well, just introspect. After all, it's something taking place in your mind. Just look in and see if you can catch it in process. But that will do you no good. In principle, no matter how good, how honest, or how acute your powers of introspection, you'll never catch your mind performing these activities. Because remember, by the nature of Kant's theory, all these activities are the precondition of having any experience of any sort, outer or inner. Whether you extrospect or introspect, before the data reach awareness, they're already processed. So by the time you look at the data, even if you peer inside your mind as hard as you cannot find these mechanisms at work. They've already taken place. So if we're to reach them, we have to reach them by reasoning. We have to deduce what they must be. We can't directly observe them. And we have to do it systematically. Now, if we are to find these synthesizing activities systematically, we must recognize that there are two basic levels of conscious awareness, the perceptual and the conceptual. And on this general point, Kant agrees with Aristotle. He says the rationalists are wrong to derogate perception, and the empiricists are wrong to derogate conception. And you remember, of course, the empiricists did precisely that by their nominalist sensualist theories. They obliterated concept. Kant says both these schools are wrong. Human knowledge involves both perception and conception. And our total knowledge is a result of both factors operating. So we have to grant both levels and their necessary cooperation in human knowledge. Now, Kant was a great one for terminology, and he gave his own name to just about everything. The faculty of sense perception he calls sensibility, and the faculty of conception he calls understanding. And he treats them in order in the Critique of Pure Reason. If we want then to find what is it the mind contributes independently of all experience, we have to break that up into two questions. The first will be, are there any a priori synthesizing activities contributed by the sensibility? In other words, are there any synthesizing activities performed by our minds on the perceptual level? And then, of course, the second will be, are there any a priori synthesizing activities performed by the understanding or performed on the conceptual level? And that's what we're looking for. Well, how will we answer? Well, let's retranslate the question again. We know that apart from the mind's acts, there's no necessity. That's the basic premise throughout the whole proof. The mind is the source of necessity. If you challenge that premise, you completely collapse Kant. You collapse both his problem and his answer to the problem. But he, of course, accepts it without question. Therefore, we can simply translate what we're looking for into this form. Are there any necessary ways of perceiving? And then, are there any necessary ways of conceiving? Because if they are necessary, then they couldn't have been just grasped from experience, because from experience we can't get necessity. If they're necessary, they must be mind contributed, and that's just what we're looking for. Now, I hope you understand this criterion. What Kant says is, find me a way we have to perceive, or a way we have to conceive, and that proves it's subjective. That proves it's contributed by the mind. That proves it's not true of reality. The very fact that we can't possibly perceive or conceive in any other way than X, whatever it is the proof for Kant that X is simply subjective, a product of the structure of the mind. And I guess this is logical if you grant that you can't get necessity from experience. Well, we have to take two levels, as I say, one at a time. Tonight, I'm going to give you only the perceptual level where the argument is comparatively brief. So we're asking, are there any necessary ways of perceiving? So that no matter what a content we perceive, we must perceive it in this particular form. Now notice the distinction between form and matter that I mentioned earlier, or the little atoms and the organization. All these a priori acts that we're looking for are relational, synthesizing type acts. They're questions of form, not of content. So we're not looking for any necessary pellets, so to speak, but for any necessary ways of putting the pellets together. The question we're asking is, are there any ways of putting our percepts together, any form of perception which is necessary and indispensable? Now, most of the things we perceive are not necessary. We could imagine them as different without any difficulty. Take, for instance, the experience of red. Now, you would have no difficulty imagining a world without any red things in it. You could just simply imagine a world which was purple, blue, green, etc., but there was just no red anywhere in it. There is, says Kant, nothing necessary to human perception in red. Red is in principle dispensable, and of course colorblind people live in that kind of world, and they can be sane and rational and so on, but they just happen to have no red in their world. And obviously that applies to all colors. And the same is true for sound. You could imagine a world in which there was no sound, and deaf people actually live in it. Therefore, sounds couldn't be contributed by the mind. Sounds, colors, those are the pellets, you see. They come from experience. Those are brute facts. And you can do the same thing for smells and tastes and temperatures, etc. All of those are contingent. They're not necessary. They're the content, not the form of experience. What would the form of experience be? Well, says Kant, I don't know if you're in suspense or not, there's only two kinds of sensory experience, and there happens to be one necessary form for each. The two kinds of sensory experience are outer and inner. Looking out, which we call extrospection, and looking in, peering into the content of your own mind, which we call introspection. And the necessary form for each is respectively space and time. Space is the necessary form that our mind contributes to govern all our extrospection. Time is the necessary form that our mind contributes to govern all our introspection. Let's look first at space. Everything that comes to us through our five senses, he says, comes to us necessarily in a spatial form. What he wants to prove is three things about space. First, that it's necessary, because if it's necessary, it's mind contributing. Second, that it's an issue of form, because remember, the mind doesn't contribute content, simply relating mechanisms. And third, and then as confirmation, he wants to show you that you couldn't get the idea of space from experience, that it's non-empirical, and that'll bolster and confirm his argument that it must be contributed by the mind. Well, let's take these points in order as far as space is concerned. Now, by space, of course, we mean spatial relationships. One thing is above another is below it. One thing is to my left, another is to my right. One thing is here, another is there. That's the type of relationships we have in mind when we talk about spatial relationships. Now, says Kant, the first point to notice is that this type of relationship is necessary. It's indispensable. All the content that we perceive, speaking now extrospectively, must be spatial. You could not imagine a sense experience which wasn't somewhere, here, there, above, below, the right, the left, the north, the south, but somewhere. It has to be spatially located. You could take any particular content and imagine it away, but you couldn't imagine a content that wasn't somewhere, that wasn't spatially located. Kant says, for instance, even if you take this desk, and I tell you, let's perform an act of abstraction. Let us think away or imagine away by a process of abstraction every attribute of this desk, its color, its size, its shape, etc. Obliterate every characteristic. The haunting, irresistible remainder that we can't banish is the place where it is, the sheer space where it is, and that you can't even think away. The there-ness of it remains unalterable. Well, if we can't even imagine it away, it must be indispensable. It must be necessary. It must be mind contributed. Well, is space an issue of form rather than content? An issue of relationships? Yes, says Kant, obviously. Loud, sweet, hot, rough, those are contents. But you can't have a special experience of space the way you can of loud, hot, sweet, and rough. It isn't a content of experience. It's a way in which experiences are organized. It's a way in which experiences are related. Space designates a relationship among the data of experience. And since the mind a priori can only provide relationships, space qualifies on this count too. The little man, so to speak, as the pellets come up, and remember now this is a bad analogy because the pellets in themselves aren't spatial. I can't speak about them, but insofar as I can, he grabs hold of them and smears them out in space, and the result is you look around you and you see things spread out in space, left, right, north, south, etc. But that's the function of the little man. Can we confirm this proof of the subjectivity of space? Well, says Kant, yes. You could never arrive at a knowledge of space by experience. And that's further proof that we must have it innately. Now, the empiricists had said, oh, sure you can arrive at a knowledge of space by experience. Look, all we have to do is say, here's one thing, here's another, and then just simply abstract from the things, grasp different locations, and form the concept space. Kant says, can't do that. Because the empiricist starts and says, here's a thing. Well, what does he mean by here? At a certain point in space. He says, there's a thing. What do you mean by there? At another point in space. In other words, says Kant, we have to know in advance what space is to be able to perceive that one thing is here and another thing is there. We must have the knowledge of space independent of experience. We couldn't acquire it from experience. Now remember that I'm presenting Kant. I'm not here giving what I regard as a valid argument, but I'm doing my best for him. The conclusion we come to then is space is necessary. It's a relational phenomenon. It's non-empirical. It must be an a priori contribution of the mind. It's a form governing our experience. It's a condition of our perceptual experience of objects. Now, if you say to me, well, but then you mean that things in themselves are non-spatial. I can't conceive that. And Kant would say, that's no argument against me. That's just further evidence of how right I am. Of course you can't conceive it. That's the whole point. The noumenal world is inconceivable. You can only conceive the world as you have processed it. So don't be upset if you can't conceive what reality would be like in a non-spatial way. That's the whole thesis of the philosophy. Now, people first introduced to Kant sometimes ask, well, how come prior to studying Kant our minds knew how to do this? Now, I think the answer is clear, but sometimes Kantians give this answer. They say, of course, that it happens entirely without your knowledge on this preconscious level. And sometimes they give the analogy of breathing. In the process of breathing, you transform oxygen into carbon dioxide. You don't have to have any knowledge of chemistry to do that. It's just an automatic mechanism which takes place. Well, similarly, in the process of perceiving, you smear everything out in space, and the result is create a spatial world. But that's the unconscious or preconscious mechanism of the mind functioning, and you don't have to know about it. It took to Kant before mankind found out about it. I may mention parenthetically, I finished the proof of space now, in case you wondered. But I may mention that in arguing that space was a mental contribution, Kant was trying to save geometry. Geometry is supposed to describe the nature of space. The geometrical theorems are supposed to give us the laws governing spatial relations. For instance, a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points. Sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees and so on. Now, says Kant, in geometry we know that these things are necessary. They're guaranteed to hold true for the future. We couldn't, therefore, have learned this kind of information on the basis of experience, because then it would be just contingent. And yet they're not simply analytic conceptual manipulations. He thought geometry actually tells you something about space. What could the solution be? If they're not just conceptual manipulations, geometrical propositions aren't analytic, we can't establish them by logic. If they're necessary, then we couldn't get them by experience. They must be synthetic a priori, which means they must come from the mind's contribution. And of course, if space is a mind-created phenomenon, then we can know its necessary laws in advance. We guarantee the laws of geometry the same way we guaranteed blue in the example of the blue spectacles, because we bring space along with us. And therefore, since our mind contributes it, we can be assured that the laws of geometry will necessarily hold on the pattern of the Kantian solution in all the other areas of philosophy. Now I can just conclude with a brief word about time. And the argument is exactly parallel. Time is supposed to be the form of introspection. You may ask in advance, why does he restrict time simply to introspection? Because aren't things in the world we perceive also in time? And the answer, to be very abrupt about it, is that he's very unclear on this point. For all practical purposes, he later allows that time is applicable to everything, inner and outer. See, introspective and extrospective, so we can think of time as the universal form of all experience. As I say, his arguments are identical. Time is, of course, we mean here the time series, one event happening now, another then, one before, another after, one earlier, another later. Is this necessary in our experience? Well, yes, again, he argues, this is indispensable. No matter what content you project, whether it's love, hate, red, cold, rough, smooth, snowball, or neurosis, it takes place sometime, now or then, sooner or later, etc. Time is therefore obviously necessary. Again, there's no special experience of time as such. You can't just experience a second. Time is a matter of relationships, and therefore it qualifies on the count that the mind can only contribute relational phenomena. And finally, again, he argues you could not derive the concept of time from experience if you didn't have that time filter in you in advance. Again, if the empiricists try to argue, well, why? We can look out and say one thing is happening now, and another is happening then, and another happens then, and then we simply abstract and form the concept time. Kant would say, well, what do you mean? How can you say one thing is happening now? Now means at a specific point of time. Then means at a different point of time. If we didn't have the concept time, we could not grasp it on the basis of experience, which is further confirmation that time is a subjective, mind-contributed phenomenon. Time and space, therefore, we conclude, are strictly forms of human sensibility. They have no metaphysical objectivity. They are not guides to reality. You might say, is that all? And Kant answers, as far as the perceptual level is concerned, that's all. There's only two. If you ask him, well, how come there's no more? On the perceptual level, he says that's just a brute fact. That just happens to be the way human beings are constructed, that perceptually they must spread out their experiences in time and space, and that there's no more. If you ask, would all species that are conscious have to have time and space? His answer is certainly not. There may be species, for all we know, that don't smear out their data in time and space. They may do it by iddle and triddle. Don't ask me what iddle and triddle is, because as a human being I have to think spatially and temporally, you see, but they may have other mechanisms for relating the data. They may have dozens of them, for all we know. We happen, as human beings, to have just two, namely space and time, and that's just a brute fact. So much for a survey of Kant's arguments on the perceptual level. Of course, his central thrust is on the conceptual level. The heart of his alleged proof is what our a priori conceptual activities are. Those a priori concepts, as distinct from percepts, he calls the categories, and his proof of those, and then the ethics, which he preaches on the basis of it, will be our subject next week. For tonight, I've brought you into the Kantian world And that's all I can do for now. Thank you. Thank you. A whole bunch of questions. The first one I've been asked is, can I suggest any reading on Kant? And that's what this one says. Could I recommend a good history of philosophy book? I would certainly recommend that you start by reading histories of philosophy. Kant himself is tortuously, hideously complicated to read. The Critique of Pure Reason, if you try to read it one sentence at a time with appropriate commentaries, takes months of full-time work to read. I give you that warning so you will not hold against yourself any difficulty you may experience in trying to read the Critique of Pure Reason. I would not recommend it as a way of getting clear on Kant's views, certainly not at the beginning. I'd suggest you begin with a couple of good histories of philosophy where you simply read summaries of Kant. And I would recommend a number of histories of philosophy for those of you who want to do any reading. One, which I commonly recommend, by W.T. Jones, called The History of Western Philosophy, in which he has quite a good section on Kant. One by Gordon H. Clark called Thales to Dewey. One by Wilhelm Windelband, that's with a W, History of Philosophy. Those three, at least, read the summaries of Kant, and you will get some overview of his system. If you actually want to go through a step-by-step analysis of Kant's arguments in the Critique, they're the best, far and away the best book I know is by Paton, H.J. Paton, P-A-T-O-N. It's a 2-volume work called Kant's Metaphysic of Experience. Kant's Metaphysic of Experience. And the 2 volumes is devoted to approximately the first 2/3 of the Critique of Pure Reason. He simply goes through it virtually one sentence at a time, explaining what he takes Kant to mean and how it relates to the other things Kant says. And I've read a number of these detailed commentaries on the Critique. This is the one that I found clearest and most intelligible. So if you have the courage to go through that's the one I would recommend. That's the presentation I'll be following throughout. Now I have a question. Could you repeat Kant's definition of objectivity? Yes, in the form that I mentioned it. A phenomenon is objective if it is the result of the inexorable, universal structure of human consciousness. It's objective if it's the result of the inexorable, universal structure of human consciousness. In other words, if a certain structure is built into the very nature of the mind, that's what we mean by inexorable. So it's not a matter of volition, you have no choice. And it's true, therefore, of every human being. For Kant, the resultant is objective. On the other hand, if something is a product of simply one human mind in an area which was volitional, then it is subjective. So that the objective amounts to the collectively subjective. Now I got a question which I have asked in a great many different ways, which is the obvious question. By what means, one person asked, does Kant know that the mind syntheses are necessary? How would he answer the objection that the mind's basic synthesizing activities might suddenly change? And another person asks, how does Kant establish necessity by his categories? How can he be sure that the mind will have different categories or even exist tomorrow? and I have that question in a variety of forms. That is obviously a perfectly valid question. It's a common objection to Kant. To just elaborate the objection for a moment, the objection to Kant is that all he did is shift the locale of Hume's problem, but didn't answer the problem. Hume looked out there at the fire which was hot and said, how do I know that the fire which is hot today will be hot tomorrow? Kant said, in effect, my mind is so built that I must perceive a hot fire today, tomorrow, etc. Well, the question is, couldn't Hume just come back to him and say, how do you know your mind, which is built this way today, will be built a different way tomorrow? If it is, then we're no farther ahead. Maybe our necessary synthesizing activities will all vanish. Now, largely Kant's answer to this will have to be postponed until next week, because that is the whole thing he wants to prove next week, that these synthesizing activities are unavoidable. I'll tell you only this much. Kant wouldn't say that he can prove these synthesizing activities are absolutely necessary, that they just have to take place no matter what. He gives up that attempt. What he does try to prove, though, is that anybody who has any form of human experience at all, he can prove has all of these synthesizing activities necessarily. The simplest illustration of it is, I simply ask you this. I'll give you 3 knocks. Now, can you hear those 3 knocks? Everybody can hear the succession of 3 knocks, right? Kant claims to be able to derive by a process of deduction, which we are going to look at next week. That's called the deduction of the categories. That if you can hear those 3 knocks, you must have 12 necessary synthesizing activities operating in your mind. And that's the only possible explanation of your ability to hear the succession of 3 knocks. Now, the whole thing is based on the fact that you can hear 3 knocks. See? Can he prove that? No, he can't prove that that's necessary. All he would say is, if somebody got to the stage where he couldn't even hear the succession of 3 knocks, he would immediately become a member of a different species. He could no longer raise any objections to me. He'd have a radically different type of mind, and he'd have his own philosophic problems, and let him answer whoever the Martian equivalent of Hume is. All I'm doing, he says, is answering the problem for human beings. The minimal definition of a human being is that he can hear the 3 knocks. If you can hear that, everything else I'll prove to you follows unavoidably from that. If suddenly we're plunged in a completely different world where we don't even have temporal succession, we can't even tell one thing coming after the other, well then in that world we can't think, we can't know, we can't argue, we can't object, we can't philosophize. We're a different species and we've got our own problems which he can't claim to worry about. So in a way this is an evasion of the question, in a way not. An evasion in that he cannot prove an absolute necessity. But not in that he says, when this would happen, even the person who asks the question couldn't ask the question anymore. Because as soon as he asks the question, he has at least the ability to connect a few things, and that presupposes all of his categories. But for the full argument, that's the deduction of the categories we're going to prove next week, starting with 3 knocks and ending with 12 synthesizing activities. Now I have a question related to that. Do the mind and its categories exist in the noumenal or the phenomenal world? Well, about the categories we can answer without question. And now I didn't introduce the word category. Category is Kant's name for the a priori synthesizing activities on the conceptual level. And there's 12. Those are definitely noumenal. We cannot perceive them. They're not accessible to experience. They exist beneath the level of experience. They are therefore noumenal. It follows, of course, that we can't know what the categories are in themselves, because we can't know anything as it is in itself. All we can know, in effect, is that something, X, is there, and that the result of it is we have all these features put in our experience. As to the question, what about the mind? Well, Kant would say, do you mean the mind in itself, or the mind as it appears to us? The self in itself exists nominally. The self as it appears to us exists phenomenally. Thus, you introspect. You, in some sense, are aware of yourself, your thoughts, your feelings, your hopes, your emotions, your loves, your hates. That's all part of you, and that's accessible to your direct experience. In that sense, your mind, yourself, is phenomenal. You can experience it by introspection. But, of course, that's just the way you yourself appear to yourself. And you can see that because even your introspective data are already governed by time. See, you have one experience and then another and then another. The self in itself, of course, is not temporal. That's noumenal, and therefore we can have no concept of it. In fact, there's a big question whether there's a distinction in reality between reality in itself and yourself in yourself, because quantity is applicable only phenomenally. So for all we know, there's only one gigantic self, of which all our phenomenal selves are just reflections. Kant didn't accept that thesis. Hegel did. Hegel's view, in effect, could, I don't know whether I was about to say simply, you couldn't put anything Hegel says simply, but his view would amount from this perspective to saying, let's just have one gigantic self, which is reality, and all of us are just expressions. Kant doesn't commit himself. All he says is whatever exists in itself is unknowable. Next question on this sheet. Well, let me do these first. Kant began by acknowledging that we can at least know contingent facts of reality. How did he wind up believing that nothing can be known? Well, we can know contingent facts of reality only if we assume, remember, only if we assume that the contingent things we observe are reality. Now, if we start off from a Humean type basis, well, you might say, well, when we look out there, we observe certain things, and that's reality. And therefore, I know at least certain contingent facts about reality. But Kant's whole thrust of his argument, which I tried to make clear during the lecture, was that he came to the conclusion that even in regards contingent truths, if we call that reality, then we're lost. That the only way we can know necessary truths which are crucial is if the world we know is a world of our own creation, just the phenomenal world. And of course, once he said that for necessary truths, contingent truths also are pulled into being simply descriptions of the phenomenal world, because the noumenal world has become unknowable. And therefore, the fate of necessary truths brought along contingent truths with it. And another question, why did Hume grant the validity of the concept of necessity in the realm of the relationships of ideas? We can't experience by the senses that a bachelor is necessarily male or that 2 and 2 necessarily make 4. Well, we had that question last week and I tried to answer. As a matter of fact, on Hume's view, you could not validate the concept of necessity in any realm on the so-called analytic statements any more than on synthetic ones. Hume would answer, by necessary, I merely mean required by our arbitrary conventions if we are to be self-consistent. That's all. And therefore, when we say bachelors are necessarily male, we could translate that and get rid of the word necessary in the following way. I propose to use the word bachelor in such a way that I won't call something a bachelor unless I also call it male. See, that's all it means to say bachelors are necessarily male. Let us use the word bachelor. This is the only possible consistent answer you could have. Let us use the word bachelor in such a way that hereafter, when we call something bachelor, it'll have to be male in order to call it bachelor. That's all he can mean by necessary. And followers of his in the 20th century have actually said that we can't even say bachelors are necessarily male. All we can say, we can't even say that that statement is true. All we can say is the statement bachelors are male represents simply a linguistic recommendation. You know, if I say to you, let's go to the movies, that isn't true or false, that's simply a suggestion, a recommendation. Well, they say bachelors are male. This is his modern followers to get around this type of problem. Some of them say bachelors are male is that same type of statement. It's simply a recommendation, simply a way of saying, let's use the word bachelor such that, etc. See? If Kant wishes to offer logical arguments in support of his critical philosophy, how can he discuss the existence of the noumenal world and support the assertion that it necessarily is the raw material of our experienced phenomenal world, when such concepts as existence and necessity apply only to the phenomenal world and not to the relationship between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world? In other words, if the noumenal world is unknowable, how come Kant knows about it? Well, this is a perfectly good and perfectly unanswerable objection. In Kant's terms, you cannot utter even the phrase the noumenal world or reality in itself. You cannot even utter it, because if I say things in themselves, well, I use a plural. That's a quantitative consideration, which I cannot apply to the noumenal world. I say thing, that sounds like an entity, but that's just a phenomenon. I say those things somehow act on us and cause certain human experiences, but causality is a relation that we create that obtains only in the phenomenal world, so I can't say that. I say, well, at least reality in itself, but reality turns out to be one of the categories. I say the way things are in themselves, but existence turns out to be another one of the categories. In other words, every crucial concept that you would use to utter things in themselves, noumenal world, reality as it really is, you are barred and banned entirely from using on Kant's own premises. So all you can say is X. You can make it singular or plural, something or nothing, more or less, causal or non-causal. You can't open your mouth about it. And of course, this was essentially the tack that Hegel took. He simply said, who needs this unknowable noumenal world, and how could Kant possibly know about it if it's unknowable? Which, from Kant's premises, is unavoidable deduction. You may ask me then, well, why didn't Kant see that? Well, he had big plans in store for the noumenal world. To begin with, I'm anticipating a point of next week, but just to keep you in mind, he was very anxious, for all that I said in the lecture about him wanting to supplant God by collective human consciousness, he was very anxious to keep God and religion in the picture. And he thought that we can't find God in the phenomenal world, but who knows, maybe we can find him in the noumenal world. Now, I don't want to give away any secrets, but you can imagine that he will pursue this lead next week. He thought you couldn't find free will in the phenomenal world, but you could find it in the noumenal world. You couldn't find immortality, an immortal soul in the phenomenal world, but you could in the noumenal world. And how he did that, that's a teaser till next week, but we can at least tell you this much in advance, although I am anticipating. If someone says to him, oh, well, your beliefs in God and immortality and so on are irrational, Kant's immediate comeback is, you can't possibly argue against these beliefs. As soon as you're using reason, you're restricted to the phenomenal world. As soon as you start arguing, you're using all these a priori synthesizing activities, and your mind is cut off from true reality. So in true reality, you see, we're free of reason. The door is open, and we can believe
on faith, and our faith will be impregnable. It will be invulnerable. Nobody can touch it. We can just throw out in advance all their arguments and objections by saying, oh, well, fine, it's all perfectly rational, but by that very reason, it has no application to reality. We'll also see that ethics has a central connection to the noumenal world. So in other words, he had his own purposes, although in logic, it is absolutely true that by the nature of his philosophy, he shouldn't have kept the noumenal world. He was still, you see, to that extent, not a Kantian. He still had the noumenal world is the last vestige of reality in the history of philosophy. He still couldn't quite encompass the idea that the whole world is nothing but consciousness, and that there's nothing out there independent of consciousness. Hegel didn't have any difficulty imagining that. Kant is still in the 18th century, after all, in the age of reason, the Enlightenment, and he didn't want to get rid of reality altogether. If Kant accepts the notion that the noumenal world exists independently of the content or a priori structure of consciousness, it is not an acceptance of the primacy of existence. It's an acceptance of existence, as I said, only in the vestigial sense that there still is an existence. But it is not in the sense of the primacy of existence, because the primacy of existence as a concept specifies the relation between existence and consciousness. The primacy of existence says existence exists and consciousness is the faculty simply for perceiving. Now that latter is what Kant denied completely. And by so doing, as I indicated in the previous question, he undermined existence because it became unknowable, and the result was subsequent philosophers dropped it. All you could say about Kant in this respect is that he retained existence in this vestigial, unknowable form, but not the primacy of existence in the sense that it is the object of consciousness, and that consciousness' sole function is to perceive it. Wouldn't analytical a posteriori truths have accomplished the same thing for Kant as synthetic a priori ones? Well, that's a switch. Does Kant consider these? Not to my knowledge, because he would say an analytical a posteriori truth. Well, let's try and imagine that would be a direct contradiction. In saying it's analytical, you are saying no experience is required to establish it. It can be established simply by logical manipulation of arbitrary definitions. By saying it's analytic, we say it's completely independent of experience. It says nothing about facts, it just expresses our conceptual manipulations. But to say it's a posteriori says it's dependent upon experience and can be validated only by direct experience. So he would argue that an analytic a posteriori combination would be a direct contradiction. Synthetic a priori, however, is not, because synthetic merely tells us it's factual, that there is the predicate adds something to the subject, but it doesn't yet tell us how we know the connection. And although everyone had thought we know it by experience, it's still possible that we could know it by finding out about the structure of the mind, and that it's the thing that really imposes the connection. How does Kant reconcile the fact that individual humans' processes of synthesizing, if these processes are universally structured, bring them to different conclusions about reality, with his concept of objectivity? That's a good question, but he's got an answer. And I'd like to stress this answer as hard as I can, because this represents a common confusion about Kant. All that your mind gives you in advance is certain fundamental principles. It does not give you the application of these principles. It gives you, so to speak, the metaphysics of the phenomenal world. It assures you, for instance, wherever there's an event, there'll be a cause. Wherever there are qualities, there'll be an entity. Wherever you have experience, it'll be spatial. or it'll be temporal, etc. That is not the same as saying the mind gives you in advance the answers to particular questions resting on these principles. The mind does not tell you in advance, for instance, the cause of cancer. It simply tells you if it's something, it has a cause because we make it causal. But what the particular cause of cancer is, says Kant, he didn't use that example, but you get the idea, we will have to follow empirical procedures. We'll have to actually study the data of the phenomenal world and try to find out what sort of conditions go along together with cancer and constitute their cause. In other words, what the mind gives you and guarantees is only that you will accept a certain metaphysics and that you can't conceive the opposite. On this you can't go wrong, and this he would say is true. He says, no one could conceive an uncaused event, or a non-spatial world or a non-temporal world. But when we come to the particular application of these, we can make mistakes. We can think things which are incorrect. We can think that A is the cause of B when in fact it isn't. Our mind does not guarantee us on that. And in this respect, it's simply a parallel to any philosophy. If Aristotle proves that every event has a cause and convinces you of that, that does not guarantee that you're going to correctly identify the cause of everything. Or if Aristotle establishes that A is A, and you're absolutely convinced and swear you're going to function on that principle, that doesn't preclude the possibility of your making errors about what any particular A is. You still have to use a certain methodology, and you can be wrong. Now, Kant would say exactly the same thing. My mind, our mind, guarantees only the basic principles. It doesn't guarantee the particular conclusions we come to when we apply them. Would Kant say that the experience of the same things in themselves are processed in the same way, or would he say that the synthetic mechanism arbitrarily processes any experience? Well, you are trying to smuggle out of me a knowledge of things in themselves which can't be had. You're implying there are certain things in themselves which are one thing, and there are other things in themselves which are something else. And what happens when we take the same thing in itself as opposed to a different thing in itself? Now, we don't even know that there's more than one thing in itself. We don't even know that there's one thing in itself. We don't even know that it's a thing. So we cannot speak, and therefore you can't say the same thing in itself versus a different thing in itself. Same and different implies a something which has identity, which has certain characteristics as opposed to others, and that brings us all back into the phenomenal world. Therefore, there's no way to answer this question. It's not as though, in effect, things in themselves are divided into three categories and three sets. And when set A acts on us, one set of filters processes it, and when set B another, and set C another. Who could know that? Because we can't know anything about things in themselves. Now, so the second half of your question, would you say that the synthetic mechanism arbitrarily processes any experience? To be exact, you'd have to correct that as follows. The synthetic mechanism doesn't process experiences. It processes the unknowable data, and experience is the result of the processing of that data. Nor does it do it arbitrarily, according to him. It does it inexorably, by the very nature of the human mind itself. All of these mechanisms operate in any experience. All of them operate in any experience. You said Kant still believed in God, but that he had substituted collective human consciousness for God's. So did Kant say man's mind said, let there be God, so there was? No. Unquestionably no. God, remember, is noumenal, which means he exists entirely independently of us. Anything in the noumenal world is independent of us and is not a result of the structure of collective human consciousness. So when I said Kant substituted collective human consciousness for God's, I even tried to cover that point in the lecture by saying, remember, that man's consciousness did not, however, for Kant, have the creative powers that God's did. God, according to the Judeo-Christian view, actually brought reality, not just the way it appeared to God, but reality in itself into existence. For Kant, man doesn't have that kind of creative power. He can't create a world out of a void. All he can do is create a world as it appears to him, and therefore he certainly is not the creator of God. Well, we have some here now from last week. Let's look at them for a minute. Did Aristotle have positive evidence to the effect that man's mind at birth is tabula rasa, or did he merely infer this to be true because no one could demonstrate the contrary? Well, no, certainly not the latter. It is true that he claimed to point out that any idea you have you could base on experience, and that therefore the idea of innate ideas was completely gratuitous, but you could construct from Aristotle's philosophy, not that he offers it in so many words, but you could construct simply an argument that an innate idea is in itself a self-contradiction, because an idea is a form of awareness of reality, normally construed as a conceptual form of awareness of reality. Now, a concept for Aristotle is an organization of percepts. Now, ask yourself, how could you have a conceptual awareness of reality independent of any percepts? That would be obviously impossible. You couldn't organize your percepts into concepts till you had percepts. And until you had concepts, you couldn't have any ideas. So an innate awareness of reality would be an awareness of reality deprived of any means of awareness. It would be an awareness of reality which took place in no form by no means, which would be a contradiction. And therefore Aristotle would hold that an innate idea is literally derives from a failure to grasp what an idea is. See, he was very much on the primacy of existence. And therefore any phenomenon of consciousness has to be defined in relation to existence. Idea is a type of awareness of reality. And therefore, obviously, we have to have a means of awareness of reality before we can talk about having ideas. And that means a sense experience. Therefore, no ideas prior to sense experience. Where do the idea of innate ideas comes from? Really from the primacy of consciousness, from the idea that consciousness is a self-contained entity, detached from reality, that its function is not to perceive reality, but merely perceive itself, merely look inward. And then, of course, for those philosophers who hold that view, they have to have something inside to look at. And an idea, they construe, in effect, it's a little mental entity inside your head that you look at, and which, on that model, of course, since it's cut off from reality, there's no reason why you couldn't have dozens of them. Except, of course, the question is then, what are the ideas of? If it were impossible to demonstrate in the light of anyone's knowledge that the mind at birth is other than a blank sheet, would that alone be enough to justify the statement that man is born tabula rasa? Well, I just offered an argument for the view, but if you say to me, on whom is the onus of proof here? I would say the onus of proof is on the person who says we have knowledge prior to experience. Because on the basis of all the evidence available to us, all knowledge begins with experience. And therefore, in the absence of any proof that there were innate ideas, even if you couldn't construct a fancy philosophic argument that the concept would be a self-contradiction, I would say yes, the onus of proof is on the person who claims there are innate ideas, and in the absence of such proof, you would be absolutely entitled to say no, there are no such things. There is a general principle of a logical argument, of course, that the onus of proof is on he who asserts the positive. And in this case, one side says there are certain possessions in the mind at birth, and the other says there are not. And then the onus is clearly on the side of the person who says there are. What schools of empiricism considered conceptualization valid and would therefore be able to claim that space can be observed? The second part doesn't exactly follow from the first. In a broad way, there are, you could say, three different types of empiricists in this respect. There is the Aristotelian type, which claims, calling empiricism now, the view that all knowledge begins with sense experience, but leaving open what's the nature of all processes of knowledge subsequent to that. On the one hand, there is the Aristotelian type, which holds that we start with sense experience, we then form concepts which are objectively based on sense experience, and which are not arbitrary or subjective, and which then goes on from there. There is then a minor type, some empiricists hold, a theory of universals known as conceptualism, which I did not mention last time, because it's a minor transitional type of school which did not last. It had its main advocates in the 17th and 18th century. You can find elements of it in John Locke, as you can find elements in him of just about every theory of universals. But the conceptualists you could think of as being between Aristotle and the nominalists. They agree with the nominalists that concepts are arbitrary in the sense that they're not objectively based on facts of reality, but they say that concepts are not simply the name for images or sense data, that in some sense we can have truly general ideas, truly abstract ideas, as distinct from simply nominalist, sensualist images and sense data. In that sense, they try to hold on to man's ability to form concepts while depriving concepts of any external metaphysical foundation. Because they deprived it of any metaphysical foundation, of course, this position didn't last and led straight to nominalism, which is the third main type here on this question, who regarded conceptualization as distinct now from sensing or having images as invalid. That's the Humean position. Now the question goes on, and which school would therefore be able to claim that space can be observed? Well, all empiricists would say that spatial relations can be directly observed. Even Hume said that. And the argument that I gave you from Kant, we may as well take care of that now, because it's grossly fallacious. By the same type of reasoning, I could prove that you couldn't learn anything from experience, even the concept of green. I could argue simply, well, the only way you could learn the concept of green is to say, well, this is green, and that's green, and that's green, and now I'll abstract what's common. But how could I know this is green if I didn't know what greenness was? Therefore, I have to have greenness innately. Now, Plato, at least, was more reputable in this respect. He held that all concepts were innate on the same type of argument. He didn't bother to distinguish out space and time. He said the whole works are innate on the basis of that type of reasoning. Obviously, what is fallacious? Take it first on the green case. I do not have to be able to say this is green in order to perceive that color. I wouldn't know what to call it if I don't have a concept. I wouldn't have categorized it yet. But I don't need any conceptual apparatus whatever to open my eyes and see the color. And I can see, this is simply a straightforward Aristotelian view. I can see it in this instance, and that instance, and that instance. And I don't need any conceptual apparatus to perceive the similarity of the various shades of green. I don't have to have the concept of similarity to perceive similarity. And even animals can perceive certain similarities without having any conceptual apparatus. You do not have to know. In order to perceive, I hold up two cups. I say, can you perceive they're similar in shape as against the shape of Mr. Godhelp? You can directly perceive the similarity of those two shapes as against this one, and you can directly perceive that without having, even as a very young child or as an animal, without having to say to yourself, now similarity means so and so, and these two have certain attributes, and therefore these two are similar. You don't have to go through any such process. Percepts are directly accessible, and the similarity of percepts is directly accessible. And therefore, all you have to do is get the raw information from sense experience, and then simply engage in a process of abstraction to form the concept of green. Now, the process is in principle the same for space or time. You can directly perceive that this cup is on this table. Now, you don't know the concept on at the beginning. But if I ask you what you mean by on the table, in the last analysis you have to point back to instances. It's the relationship that this cup has to the table, that this paper has to the lectern, that my hand has to my head. For the people on the tape series, my hand is now on my head, etc. You merely perceive a number of instances, and you can perceive the similarity of the relationship, abstract, and grasp the idea of position. And then, of course, you simply observe different positions and formulate, by a process of abstraction, the concept spatial relation. You don't have to know the concept here to perceive that this is here. The only way to know that it's here is to look. And the same is true for time. What is Kant's concept of identity? Is this one of his categories? No. Identity is not a category. If you mean identity in the sense of the law of identity, everything is what it is, that is not a synthetic proposition. The law of identity is an analytic proposition. A is A. Remember the definition of an analytic proposition. Analytic proposition is one in which the very definition of the subject includes the predicate. You can get the predicate out of the subject simply by logical analysis. Well, A is the paradigm, perfect example then of an analytic statement, because the predicate is identical to the subject. Therefore, it simply restates the subject. It's a classic example of an analytic statement. As such, says Kant, his categories do not turn out analytic material. Analytic material just represent our conceptual manipulations. His categories are concerned always with synthesizing and with producing, therefore, synthetic a priori propositions. And therefore, the law of identity is not his business, he says. In fact, he makes it very clear in the critique. He says, as far as the laws of logic are concerned, and that includes, of course, the law of identity, he agrees entirely with Aristotle. He's taking over the laws of logic from Aristotle. He says he has the greatest respect for Aristotle. He says that repeatedly. He wouldn't dream of tampering with the laws of logic and so on, and he proceeds to try to use them in his proof, which we're going to look at next week, of the categories. So he says his whole system rests upon Aristotelian logic, and he wouldn't think of touching it. The division of labor, as he saw it, is in effect Aristotle took care of analytic truths, and he, Kant, is going to take care of synthetic truths, you see. Now, needless to say, this is a hopeless division of labor. And I mean not only because the whole analytic-synthetic distinction is invalid. And Kant, when he uses logic, is actually using the laws of logic as a complete stolen concept, because on his philosophy he has no way whatever of establishing. We can explore this for a moment, since this is a point that will not be in the lectures, but it's a significant point on Kant. Aristotle claimed that he arrived at the law of identity, the law of contradiction, excluded middle, by directly perceiving reality. He perceived certain things are so, and therefore the cup is a cup, the microphone is a microphone, the wristwatch is a wristwatch, and he just abstracted from there, A is A. And therefore he had a foundation for the law of identity. It was a direct law of reality. Now Kant wants very desperately to use the laws of logic because he wants to give what he considers a logical, airtight, proven case. But now what is his account of why the laws of logic are valid? They no longer can be valid because they correspond to facts of reality, because reality is now unknowable. So what must be Kant's account of logic? Well, he hints at it in his book on logic. He suggests it unclearly, and his later followers made it fully clear. The general Kantian view on logic is this: the laws of logic are not laws of reality. They are laws of human psychology. They are laws governing how human beings necessarily have to think when they analyze concepts, when they engage in deductive reasoning. And therefore, what is the justification for the laws of logic? Simply that this is the way people have to think. It happens to be, this is what the later Kantian said, it happens to be a brute fact that the human mind is so constructed that men have to believe that A is A, and that nothing can be A and non-A at the same time in the same respect. But that's just an irreducible fact of the structure of human consciousness. Well, of course, once you look at it that way, once you take that view, you cannot establish it. Because the question is, how does Kant know that human beings have to think that way? What does he do in the face of human beings holding contradictions? Now, if obedience to the law of contradiction is a necessary law of the human mind, you could not account for the fact of people holding contradictions. See, Aristotle has no problem with people holding contradictions. Because Aristotle simply says, well, you're wrong. You're violating the law of identity, which is based on reality. But if you say the laws of logic are nothing but laws of governing the human mind, then as soon as somebody violates those laws, they're not laws anymore. If they're not laws anymore, why should we think in accordance with them? Just in the same way, if you say the law of gravity is a law governing the behavior of matter, and if things started to violate it, you would have to say, well, so much the worse for the law of gravity then. It isn't true. And Kant's view on logic reduces it simply to the way people actually think, and since, in fact, people can hold contradictions, he destroys the foundation of logic and is left in the position that he can't justify the very laws of logic he's using for his inferences. Do we have any brief ones? Well, that's a good question. In the terms of his own theory, how can Kant propose his views as knowledge of what is? He claims that because the mind itself contributes order to experience, it can never know what is the case independently of experience. Is he not making an exception of his own theory and claiming it as knowledge of what is the case? And of course the answer is yes. Kant claims to stand outside of his own theory, to look at the process of knowledge and say there are these noumenal synthesizing activities, categories, and so on, which operate upon our minds in themselves and which yield our present state of knowledge. And this claims to be a description of the way things really are. See? And to that extent, of course, he is violating his own philosophy. What is his only possible way out of this objection? If he tells you, as his followers do, well, really, I'm not saying anything about the way things really are. I'm not really saying what the categories are in themselves, because I don't know what anything is in itself. And so can I really say there's 12 categories? Well, I can't say in itself there's 12 categories, because quantity, you see, is one of the things we add. All I can say is describing human knowledge as it appears phenomenally, we find in it features that we could not derive from experience, which, therefore, we will describe as independent of experience, a priori. We can simply state, as they show up in experience, what are they? But what in itself they are and what goes on to bring them, we cannot possibly know at all. So in other words, he can get out of this only by again pleading invincible, unavoidable ignorance of what the categories and their operation really is. But if you ask me, really, no, he cannot get out of that, because when he opens his mouth, he claims to be telling us the way something really is. Now, if you want the complete bizarre extreme of a consistent Kantian, I had a professor once, I'd written a paper on Kant, and I maintained a certain interpretation of Kant, and he was telling me, you can't be sure that your interpretation of Kant is correct. There are, after all, so many interpretations. Patton has one interpretation, Kemp Smith, another commentator, has another, and Wolff has another, and so on. How do you know yours is correct? So I said what I thought was humorous. I said, you mean we can never know the noumenal Kant, just the phenomenal Kant? Which I thought was a joke, you know, that was reductio ad absurdum, and he said, absolutely right. He said, that's very well put. Nobody can know what Kant in himself actually said. All we can know is Kant as filtered by Patton, or Kant as processed by Kemp Smith, etc., you see. Therefore, all you can get is the phenomenal Kant, and you've had Kant as processed by Peikoff. You see, that's the category that was operating. Now, you see, that's the whole philosophy is then self-refuting, because you can't know what he said in himself. All you can know is how it appears to you. Well, we have time for one brief one. This isn't brief, but I can't resist it. This will be the last one. Would Kant define synthesis as the mental direct manipulation of raw sensory data? No. There's several things wrong with that. First of all, by the time you say sensory data, it's already been processed. Remember now, you mustn't think that there's a reality out there which operates on our eyes, ears, and so on. Our eyes, our ears, our tongue, our sense organs are products of the categories operating on noumenal data, so that the senses themselves are phenomenal. So you mustn't think that we somehow have sense data. That's what's so terribly misleading about my analogy that we experience pellets coming through the senses and so on. The senses are the result of the operation of the categories on X. I don't know. See. So you would never say that synthesis operates on sensory data. Synthesis operates on X, on noumenal raw stuff which you can't talk about. It's the putting it together. The person underlines direct. Is it the direct manipulation? I don't know what you mean by direct. It's the putting together of that of that indeterminate data in such a way that the result is the world in which we live. If so, wouldn't all consciousness require such manipulation or processing? Well, Kant would say to that, no. I think we should postpone that for next week, but he grants the possibility of a very low-level type of consciousness which does not engage in synthesizing activities the way human beings do, but which is therefore devoid of the possibility of anything like human knowledge. All he would say is that any consciousness which has anything like human knowledge has to engage in these synthesizing activities. But, for instance, if we take just the three-knock example, he would hold that it's in theory possible that there could be a being that could hear the first knock. And then by the time the second knock came, the first one was completely vanished. By the time the third one came, the first two were completely vanished. So it was in effect like a tabula rasa with each knock. See, he heard one knock and then it was vanished, and then he heard the next one and that's all. And of course that type would be like a newborn babe at each instant. It never engages in any synthesizing activities. It just sort of brute sits there and observes. That would be at worst the lowest possible type of animal, and we're going to use that as an example next week. The salmon is alleged to be that, and we're going to contrast the salmon with man and show how man, in contradistinction to the salmon, must have at least 12 concepts. Well, that takes us to 10:30 and will hold you till next week. Thank you.
This course continues with Lecture 3.